I do see some familiar faces. So you may have heard me talk about heuristic evaluation before. It's a really great method, and I'll tell you why. And so we'll outline the steps of heuristic evaluation generally, but then we're really going to concentrate it in on information visualizations and dashboards and see how we can evaluate those and improve them and make them better for people to use and understand. I'm just going to start out with a quick little introduction. Again, as Evangeline kindly mentioned, I'm into lots of stuff. Most of it has to do, it's centered from the standpoint of human factors and human-centered design. So whenever we think about people, we have to think about, we have inherent capabilities. We're really good at some stuff, and we also have limitations. We can only do so much stuff. And then when we're pushed beyond that, in terms of fatigue or time limitations or interruptions, these things can all impact how well we're able to do our jobs. So what I always think about is how we can design spaces, user interfaces, anything to be more effective with the way that we know that human brains work. And then the human-centered design part will come in a moment. I'll explain that in a second. So I just like to, I always like to talk about toilets for some reason, because they're excellent and terrible examples of design. So this one, I haven't been there recently. This was from a few years ago. But this is actually on the UVic campus, and it is through the Biblio Cafe. If anyone has been there, you can chime in and let me know if it's still like this. So it's just a single stall. And I was in a bit of an urgent trip to the bathroom. So I go in and I flip the lock, and I'm literally sitting on the toilet. And then I realized, then I start reading what is on the door, and it said that this one was ineffective, but this was the one that you had to use to lock the door, which I hadn't locked. So I actually didn't get walked in on, but luckily I was not in a compromising situation. But this is just one example of, if you have it there, people are going to try to do it. And even when I was doing it, I was like, oh, there's not a lot of resistance. Like, something kind of clicked into me that something wasn't right. But an easier way to do this would just be to have, if you can't use the deadbolt for some reason, just to have a blank spot there instead. So people don't try to do that and end up like me and get walked in on. And then we have the contrast. Airplane bathrooms have some really excellent, I know they're super tiny, but they cram a lot of stuff in there. But they do have at least one really excellent example of design. And that is, usually in most of them, the lights won't turn on until you lock the door. And this is a really good cue for you to know that the door is locked, and you won't start doing anything before your lights are on. This can also be seen in like older cars, where your dashboard lights will come on dim when you turn on the car, but you have to actually turn on the headlights so that the dashboard lights brighten up. My mom's car is old, and it actually doesn't do that, and the dashboard lights come on. So both she and I have caught ourselves without our lights on. So again, an example of good and bad design. It's all over the place. So I just want to again say that I work in human factors, but from a human-centered design process. So saying that we know a lot about people, and we have these really great design principles and things that we know. However, the best way for us to understand particular contexts and tasks is really to talk to and study the people who are doing them. So it is really about generating design solutions that will work for people and not for administrators or other people who are procuring systems, but for the people themselves. And we're going to talk about evaluation. There are a few main methods when it comes to these sorts of studies, and we have inspection methods, which is what we're covering today. So we're going to do some heuristic evaluation, and basically those are just expert reviews of systems using rules of thumb, principles, or guidelines to say that here's what we know is good design, and this is not matching up, or this is an example of really good design. I always like to include strengths of systems when I do my evaluations, because I don't want to seem like I'm always tearing people apart. And I also like to include recommendations in my evaluations, because it gives people an opportunity for them to move forward with things instead of, again, just shutting ideas down. The gold standard of evaluating any sort of system is usability testing, where we would have representative users doing tasks that they would normally do. Oftentimes we concentrate in on risky tasks or tasks that they do frequently ones that we want to make sure that they're error free, but we also want to make sure that they're quick for them to do because they're going to do them often. Risky tasks, we want to make sure that they're safe and nothing's getting through the cracks. And then we can also do naturalistic testing. So once something has been released out in the wild, we can also study how it's working. But ideally, we want to be proactive and get a lot of the bugs and kinks out of the system before we release it. So this also comes from some of Dr. Baricki's work, where would we do a heuristic evaluation? Well, I'll tell you a couple times. Oftentimes, really early in the phases, you can do it on prototypes, you can do it on early systems, on partial systems. You can use this early on. And why I like to do that is I'm about maximizing my time with my users because, especially in healthcare, trying to recruit healthcare professionals to participate in our studies can be challenging. And we know that their time is super valuable now more than ever. So what we want to do is we don't want to use our time testing when we have principles that could have caught these things before. We want to use them for specific things around the system and not just general design principles that they're like, oh, the back button doesn't work or something like that. So that's why heuristic evaluation is great, because it's pretty inexpensive and you can do it early on and get some of those easy to fix errors out of the way. There are also other reasons why it's great. I'm not sure if this was distributed to you. Can someone just let me know in the chat box if you got the pre-workshop tasks? If you didn't, that's okay. We'll have time for you to do them over the break. Just pop it into the old chat box. If you got these pre-workshop tasks, is that a shaking the head? No, can't see for sure. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Don't worry, I'm going to show them again and we'll go over them later. So I'm just going to ignore them for now. But as a prelude to what you'll be doing during the break and after is that I'd like you to use what you're going to learn today to come back and talk about some of the things that you find in visualizations out in the wild. We have more examples than ever now, partially thanks to COVID. And so you can look at those and use the rules of thumb that we're going to talk about today to say why you like them or don't like them and give us some examples. So heuristic evaluation, who is that we usually have one or a few usability experts looking at a system. And like I said, it's an expert review using these guidelines or rules of thumb. You can do it pretty much anywhere. Like I said, we want to do it early and often multiple times, especially if we're going to do new versions or anything like that. Or if we've had some iteration, we might want to run it through a heuristic evaluation again to get those kind of low-hanging fruit is what I think about these issues as. And the idea is, again, to identify opportunities and improve systems and eliminate problems. Sometimes before you test with users, sometimes it's when things are already released in the wild and you have a revision planned. So you know that you want to make things better. So this can be helpful then as well. And basically just the expert or experts are going to use the system to perform a task or tasks and then compare it against these heuristics. So we're going to keep these in mind when we use the system and then step through all the things we would need to do to accomplish a task as though we were a user. So I kind of break it down into 5 steps. So usually the first and most important step is to pick a set of heuristics and make sure that you really know them kind of inside out. The more you know them, the easier this will be. But I also keep them up and keep them handy when I'm doing these so that I can always reference back and say, oh, is it this one or this one? Let's look at the descriptions. Then you want to conduct the tasks using the system with the heuristics in mind. And then while you're doing that, as each thing comes up where you're like, oh, that was really neat that it did that, or oh, that was really frustrating, or it didn't work like it was supposed to, you're going to document those. And so you're going to look at the strengths and issues and document them. And then you're going to look at each of those problems. Sometimes you can do it at the same time. Sometimes you wait until later, but give them severity ratings. And the severity ratings, the key idea with those is that you're going to use them to prioritize fixes. If something's a really big problem or is super frustrating or people are going to encounter it multiple times a day, you're going to want to get rid of that sooner than something that's just kind of cosmetic or not really that much of an issue. It's kind of bothersome, but not as problematic, or would be something that would be less frequently encountered by users. And then the idea is to inform the next iteration. Like I said, come up with recommendations so that you can move the system forward in an iterative way, and then it'll be better the next time around. So picking a set. So step one is picking a set and familiarizing yourself with the heuristics. This is going to be the longest step. So we have lots of different sets of heuristics. One of the most commonly used ones are Nielsen's 10 heuristics. He originally, developed them with a fellow named Moloch, but Nielsen really got a lot of the credit afterwards. So they have 10 heuristics, and they're very general. So they could work for specific software. They're also useful for apps. They don't cover everything, but they do, like I said, they get those low-hanging fruit of things that we would know would be a problem for users and get them identified so we can resolve them and get them out of the way. We also have sets that are specific to particular things that you might want to do. So, so we have the one that we're going to look at today, which are heuristics for information visualizations by Dowding and Merrill from 2018. And then we have ones that I came up with some colleagues, consumer health information systems. So when we're thinking about systems that are designed for regular people, what are other things that we need to think about in addition to kind of general principles? There are some for medical devices. And Dr. Barucki and Dr. Kushner also collaborated on some that are more related to patient safety, when that is a really key goal of your evaluation. So depending on what you're doing, you would pick a different set or maybe combine a couple sets. That's up to you. But today we're going to become familiar with these ones. And spoiler alert, most of them are actually Nielsen's because they're so general and so useful. So the first one of 10 is looking at the visibility of system status. So the idea here is that the system should let us know what it's doing, and we should have feedback about that. So we want to know what's going on at all times, and whether, if we've done an action, is something happening in response? Do we just need to wait a little longer, or did it crash, or did it freeze, or what's happening? So some examples of that you might have seen are if I drag something into another folder, if I'm copying something somewhere, it will show me a progress bar and it will tell me about how long it's doing that. So it's telling me that things are happening, that my drag and drop was successful and I'm copying it somewhere, and it lets me know how long it's going to take. So this is a really good example. These ones give slightly less feedback. So you don't know how long it's going to take for these. You may have seen these recently. Or you'll see them sometime today potentially, but the idea here is that all of these different components of the visualization are loading, and they go until they pop up, and then the other ones stay until it takes. So some bad examples of visibility of system status are this one here, because when it's preparing to copy, I find this especially happens when I'm working on the VPN, but it looks like it's complete, but they changed it. It used to be like diagonal bars to show the progress, but now it's kind of a different glowing gradient that happens. And so it could, if I just glanced at it, it'd be like, oh, it's already done, but it's not already done. And the pinwheel of death, or the beach ball of doom, or whatever you want to call it, that happens to me sometimes, and you're like, oh no, is this going to go away, or do I have to hard restart my computer? What's happening? When I'm working on a PC in particular, I encounter this problem where I click something and I try to open it, and I click it again and it doesn't work, and I click it again, and then all of a sudden I find out that what's happened is that new windows are actually opening in behind of the window that I've opened, but I can't see that. So there's no feedback to the user that my click has actually been successful. So then I keep doing it, and then I find that I've opened things 100 times, or hopefully I've just resolved my issue and gone back to a Mac, because I'm basic like that. So the second one is match between the system and the real world. And the idea here is that we want to align what users use to talk about things and what the system uses. So we want to use familiar concepts and phrases and words, not system-oriented terms. So at one point on one dashboard, on a COVID dashboard review that I did, there was one called epi-linked cases. And I was like, I don't know what epi-linked cases are. What does that mean to me? They've actually since taken it out, which I think was a good call. But we want to follow real world conventions and make information appear in a natural and logical order. And some examples of that can be like, because we read left to right, we often visualize time as left to right. Like if someone flipped that on you and put the newest date on the left-hand side and the oldest date on the right-hand side, that would take us a while. And it's not a good use of our cognitive resources either to do that. So when we have things that we can leverage, like conventions and that sort of thing, we want to actually use those because it'll make it easier for our users to understand things more quickly. So some examples are that we don't tend to talk about large numbers like this. Like I really have to think about it, about is that millions? Are we in the billions? There's a lot of commas and I'm not really sure where we are. Whereas we have another example that shows the exact same data and it's 539 million. And not that these ones don't count, but it is the way when numbers get big, we have a really hard time comparing them. So it can be more helpful if we're a little bit more general rather than specific. And so what was I going to highlight here? Oh, sorry, my thing moved. But matching between the system and the real world on this one is that, I'm just going to go back so you can see it. So here, down here, if you can read that, it says admin 0. And you're like, what does that mean? Who is admin 0? What do they have to do with anything? And then you click it and it goes to admin 1, I think, and it still doesn't help you. And I can't figure out really what the changes are. So again, like if you're going to use a label, make sure that the label makes sense to users. And then the other thing is that this should be, sorry, over this arrow. But the other thing on this page is that, so we have these toggle arrows for this main display here, and it doesn't tell us where we're going to go. So it's a little bit of an orientation thing, which we'll come to later, but it's also that, so we're on 28 day now, but where would we go if we click that? So more matches are that and I had to test this out in order to figure out what it was going to do. So that means that it's probably not very intuitive, but the idea is that if you change you can change the amount of time that it's showing, but it still uses the same bar. So it's a bit confusing, I found, using it. So it's not a natural way. Like even if we talked about looking at recent months or years or that sort of thing, you'll see some good examples I find in the Fitbit app. The Fitbit's the one that I have. I'm sure the other monitors do that. But when you want to change the view, they have different ways of doing it, and it's more aligned with the words that regular people would use. So that's something to think about. The next one is user control and freedom. And the idea here is that humans are curious little creatures and we want to try things out and we want to be able to move forward and back, and we want to often be able to have our own workflows and look at things when we want to look at them. But we shouldn't be having the system guide this for us. We also want to be able to try things, but then not have it impact everything forever. So we want emergency exits like the little X's so that we can close out of things or go back or that sort of thing. And essentially, we want to make users have their own decisions without impacting things in the other areas of the work that they're doing. So really good examples of this are the forward and back buttons. In terms of especially COVID dashboards that we saw were the expand and collapse buttons. Some of them, it seemed a little bit ridiculous that they would even let you expand and collapse them like a number. Like it didn't show you any more data about the number. It just literally made the number like really big on your screen. So some of them were used a little willy-nilly, if you will. But the browser button working is really important, especially for people with limited health literacy. This is what the literature shows us. And one of the challenges that we have with a lot of these dashboards is that our back button doesn't actually take us to our previous display. It will take us to the last page we were on. So they aren't always connected. So users sometimes have trouble with that. So it's something to be mindful of, and hopefully we end up getting that resolved at the system point soon. So Consistency and standards is a pretty straightforward one. This is the idea that once we're within a dashboard or when we're in a particular operating system, we want to follow the conventions of that that exist. So we don't want to wonder whether in the same dashboard, whether words are being used differently or the same, or buttons or that sort of thing. So we want things to be consistent, again, within the particular system that we're talking about, but also we also have conventions that we follow if we were working in iOS versus Android, for example, or other browsers or that sort of thing. So what we want to do again is leverage that idea that we have things that are familiar for people and the same, and that's where they're going to look for them. So for example, if we wanted to log into something, does someone want to pop into the chat box where we would look for a login if we were just on a web page, if we were going to log in or log out? Where on the screen would we look for that? I'm going to use a lot of chat box activity, so get your typing fingers ready. We've got a wave, top left or top right, absolutely. Yeah, oftentimes it tended to be before, they were kind of like trying to figure out, I think it's more gone in the direction of the top right. But yeah, we wouldn't expect to see it on the bottom, that's for sure. And so one of the examples of consistency and standards is from the BC COVID dashboard. And what I found here was that it tells us that the y-axis varies between the graphs, but it doesn't. So they're actually the exact same. So this means that this note stays here, and in some cases, the y-axis will vary, but the other thing is it puts it over here where this one is always the same, and then this one will vary. So it doesn't really help us out, but it's not being consistent, because if you're going to change one, you could change both. There are different ways also to solve problems, so we have to think about that. And then, so here we see that it does have a similar pattern and you're looking at it. And if you were quickly glancing, you might not notice, but this one actually does have a different y-axis value. So it's only 700. Another example of consistency and standards is that, so this is the total BC cases, but the color code is like a dark blue, which seems to map onto the males here for some reason. And I'm not even really sure why we have this, because it didn't seem to be something we were really looking at a lot, but, and it also seems to be fairly balanced. So it's not really giving us any insights, but they color code the province in purple. So then you might relate purple to Fraser Health, for example, or something else that wouldn't necessarily be linked. So there are opportunities here, especially with our legends, for us to color code things the same way throughout a visualization or dashboard, so that we are consistent and we're communicating the information for the same way for people. Now, yes, so to actually change anything, you go here. I'm not going to get into that one yet. So this is another example. They use the same color scheme up here. Sorry for the low fidelity, but they use the same color scheme up here, but then they also use the same color scheme, but it means completely different things in the bottom. So we want to avoid that where possible. I know we want to make things consistent, but we also want to make them make sense. So recognition rather than recall, this is a really valuable one. And it, again, really taps into our idea of cognitive resources. So whenever we have to remember something or hold on to it even for a little bit amount of time, that's going to take up our working memory. It's going to use some of the stuff that we have to do potentially other things. So the idea is that we don't want to have people to have to try to remember where things are or how to get them or have weird sequences. We want to make things that are important. We want to make them visible. We shouldn't have to remember one thing from one page to another or one dialogue to another. And we want instructions to be visible and easily retrievable. So that could mean that we might want to hide our legend at some points in time, which they do often on dashboards, but we might want to make them available for people as well. Oh, this is an old one. So some examples are tooltips, but I didn't have a good example for that one, sorry. Flexibility and efficiency of use. This is the idea that when people use a system frequently, so it might not be, well, it's not going to be the same with COVID dashboards because maybe we use them a little bit for a little while, but it could be really important with things like monthly reports or that sort of thing. But when people do the same thing over and over, or we want to look at the same views, we want to find ways to make this faster for them to do it. So they should be able to do things more efficiently. So when we're thinking about regular things, that's often shortcut keys. It doesn't tend to work so well in dashboards. Oh, I feel like I might be on the wrong version. Any sort of searching. But if we go back, sorry, and we look here, so here we would have to select if we wanted to look at just interior or just Fraser. But ideally what we'd want is if I wanted to just look at Fraser and have Fraser everywhere, what I would want would to be able to click on the bar or click on this part of the bar so that I could just look at that part. So having filters embedded in other things, and I know Tableau does this pretty well where you can change the view according to what you select. So that's really helpful for people. Okay, so aesthetics and minimalist design. This is, again, one from Nielsen's 10 heuristics, but when you may, hopefully you've heard of Edward Tufte by now, but he was one of the first advocates for removing extraneous ink and the idea of a data ink ratio. But the idea here is that the more information we put into a display, the more distracting it is and the harder it is for people to know what's important, what they should be concentrating on. Also, the more alternatives we introduce, the harder it is for people to make a choice. So the idea here is that every additional unit of information is going to compete with each other. So the more we have there, the more distracting it is. And we want to make things more obvious and visible and straightforward for people. So we want to present the largest amount of data with the least amount of ink. And oftentimes this comes down to meaning, does it look nice? Is it cluttered? Could it be simpler? So I just mentioned the data ink ratio. So there's the idea that when we're visualizing or illustrating data, we have that ink. So anything that's in a bar or a line or that ink. And then we also have the total ink, so anything that's not actually communicating data. And that is what makes up the data ink ratio. This is a really good video. I'm hoping I didn't maximize the volume for this, but I hope, or optimize it, but I hope that you can hear it okay. Or maybe you don't even hear it. Yeah.
I can't actually hear the video.
I can't hear it either. I think we can probably just watch it because it is annotated.
Okay.
So I'll just be quiet for a minute. So in this example, we can see now from about here that this one really pops out at us, where we could see it, but we might not know the specific value. We might not know other things. So by taking away all of the clutter and all of the extra stuff, we really hone in on what the data is actually saying. And that's the main principle for it there. Okay. So some good examples of this are Google. Google's one of the best because you hardly see anything, but man, does that engine work for us all day, every day. And other examples are here. So here we have a lot of data and ink, and we talked about how the numbers were a bit confusing. And here we have something that is also pretty big. Like these icons don't really buy us anything. And the dark backgrounds tend to distract. I know we do it. And then we have how Google displays it. So pretty straightforward. The other thing that they're doing here is they're adding an extra Q, which we'll talk about in a second, but they're giving us little previews of the flags, which help us associate what country we're looking at. And then we see that they use the simplified numbering and they've already ranked them for us. So this would be very similar data, except I don't think they include Taiwan to this, the different numbers, interestingly. And then the other thing is we have to think about other questions that people would ask of this data. So what are the respective population sizes? Is the United States really doing that bad, or is it just because they're so big? So these have been some things that we need to think about. Some other examples are we have a lot, it's not so much the extra ink here, but it really is that it's a really long page. So I had to do all of it, but I think only to about maybe here is above the fold if you're full screen. And then here, even though they tried to help us out by if you hover on anything, it'll tell you and you get the pop-ups, it just becomes really confusing. And even down here, like I don't even think I could tell which one was which or which line was going where. So it becomes more trouble than it's trying to solve. Whereas we have examples where things are more simple, use even more simplistic color palettes, and it just is a lot more calm for us to think about. This one is a bad example with lots of colors and you don't know where to look. So spatial organization is also a really important component. So how the dashboard or the display is laid out. So when we're looking for things, is it easy for us to find them? And are things, does it feel balanced, or is it kind of cluttered on one side versus another side? So that can be, well, it is something that we also want to think about when we're looking at it. So we have some pretty good spatial organization here. And then here is pretty good too. It's nice laid out in a grid. And that is what I would recommend, is going with a grid. So here we see that, well, you might not have seen it as quickly as I have because I've looked at these photos before, but we noticed that this one is sticking out a little bit more. So either I would make these wider so that they line up and then make those ones light up. Like you want things to line up. Otherwise it creates visual tension and it attracts the eye automatically, which is not what we want to do. And same thing when we see these tabs here, they don't go right flush to the edge, which doesn't make any sense to me. And same here and here. So things that we should think about is that we have particular ways. There's been a lot of studies on how we tend to look at web pages or dashboards or anything. And the idea here is that for left to right readers, we often operate, and usually this is unconsciously, but we'll scan something in kind of a Z pattern. So we look across the top for information, then we scan down on diagonal, and then we'll look across the bottom. So with this tends to be ones without much text, which are usually dashboards. So we're visually just kind of scanning things. And now I'm going to get you to man your typing stations again. I don't know if this is working as well because you're not connected individually. So I don't think you can. So if anyone feels like they want to jump in verbally, let me know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a dashboard just quickly, and I want you to tell you what you notice about it just first, like what your first sort of impression is. Oop. Okay. Did you see anything? I know I flashed it too many times. Blue color. Was there any area that your eye was drawn to?
The top.
Yeah, the top left, probably around there, because this is the darkest part, right? It has the most contrast. It seems intuitively like this is going to be the most important, when in actuality, this is probably the least important. It's great that it's St. Martin's Clinic, and maybe we would want that in something small, but we don't want it to take up this much valuable resource. As we know, we usually land here because this is where we expect to start from. So if you wanted something that was a bigger logo, you might want to include something small at the top to let people know. But if you needed something bigger, you might want to include it here. The other thing is if we think about the data to ink ratio, we're not really, like, this is not buying us much, the emergency sign picture. All right, so we'll try one more and hopefully the animations go more smoothly. Did you see anything that time? I'll flick it one more time. Anything there? Bottom left, bottom left. Okay, great. Thank you for playing along with my games. Bottom left, everyone's in the bottom left. Whoop, whoop. Yep, it's true. And kind of the same reason is these are the darkest colors and it's the most densely populated with ink. So think about that when you want to focus someone's attention on something, that you can play with these contrast areas. If you're like, this is the most important stuff I'm going to tell you today, I'm going to put it right in this dark spot, and you can locate that. The other thing is then you can draw the eye towards something where it wouldn't necessarily get as much attention. But ideally, if you want something important, you want it, this is the zone. This is the zone of importance. And this one, hold on. Anything there? Jump out at you?
Pie chart.
Pie chart? I've trained you so well, Evangeline. We'll talk about those shortly. The top-ish, middle left, it was overwhelming. Yeah, it's a lot, but it's also fairly balanced. So this, I would say, this is quite a bit of ink, and here. So yeah, so this is going to draw our eye. These are precise measurements, of course, but it gives you that idea that without us even knowing it, our eyes want to do things for us because they're trying to make sense of the world all day, every day. They have a lot of work to do. So we're sucking them in with particular tricks that we use with design, or sometimes we're doing it unintentionally, and that's even worse when we're drawing people into a particular area when we shouldn't be. So the idea here is that we want is the most important, the zone of importance, as I'll call it, is typically we want kind of an overview or summary in this top left quadrant. Then these ones are more the supporting or specific information we'll put to complement this overview. And then the least important information should go in the bottom right. If we have other important information, we might want to have it centered and have things around it. It depends. You might have to try out different layouts and see what works for you and test it out with people. Users are the best. When we look at pages that are more densely populated with text, what we see, so these are heat maps of how they've done studies with eye trackers. So it will, the warmer it is means the more time people's eyes spent on it. And typically you end up getting this classic kind of F pattern. So we scan that way. So in addition to removing extraneous ink and designing to the grid, we also want to cut the clutter where we can. I know that this is probably going to be one of the most challenging things, both personally, because you're like, oh, well, I have this great data, I can show it to people. But is it going to be of value to them is one thing you should ask yourself. The other thing is you might get into a situation where you have competing interests with other stakeholders that you're doing the designs for. And that's also going to be a challenge, as you say, well, we actually don't have people looking at that data, and we can put it on another page or a subsequent page or bury it a little bit so that this main page, so you might have to do some advocating for this, but cutting the clutter is really important. And I say, does it add value or spark insight instead of joy? So confusion and clutter are the failure of design, not the attributes of information. So oftentimes we're like, well, we need all this data, we have to include all this information, otherwise people are going to know. But what Edward Tufte says is that it's not actually that, it's that we've done our jobs kind of poorly because we haven't streamlined things for people. It's like if you, it's like we want it to be the too long don't read version. And then we want to have people have the potential to explore things. If they do want to read and do the in-depth, there should be that opportunity, especially because we're working digitally, that they can unfold more information as they want it. But we don't want to give that to them all at once because it's not great. And round to the nearest percent. So our dashboard has all the different KPIs we can track now. And this can be the tendency of people, especially when they get excited about stuff, is they'll put in everything. And then what's that KPI trending at 0? How well we understand. And that's because there's so much stuff happening here. So another way I wanted to reframe this is the idea of the Hicks or Hicks-Hyman law. And this is a very old-ish one. So from the 50s. And the idea is that similar to when we were talking about the more information, the more it makes it harder for us to decide what's important. This is really that. It's the more distractors we have, the longer it's going to take a person to make a decision, because they're like, oh, but maybe I should pick that button over there. So this matters when we think about how many buttons are in an option, how many elements are displayed in a field, all of it. Anytime we have more things, people are going to have to weigh their decisions, and we want to minimize that again for people so that we're making their lives easy. Think about your jobs as making people's lives easy. So especially when we want people to come to decisions quickly, like if we were looking at a hospital dashboard or something like that, we don't want to overwhelm them or confuse them with too many choices. And we want fewer options to simplify things. So simplified display, they changed it before and after. Again, a little bit, this also has to do with the weight of the colors, the values there. And this is a simplified version of that. And there's always the keep it short and simple principle, which, like I said, I know you're going to have to battle, but I have faith that you can make it more aligned with user needs and not with stakeholders' ideas of putting the bathroom sink in your dashboard. Using white and negative space is quite important. So giving padding to things. So here we have less padding. Here we have more padding, just to give things a little bit of room to breathe visually. Oops. And it's going to make it easier to read. It's also going to make it less overwhelming, and it's going to associate them as a group. So it's going to be easier to tell that this is separate from that, essentially. Okay, so information coding. So I mentioned this before when we were talking about the flags. The flags are things that we associate with the countries because we have one per. And so the idea here is that we have lots of symbols and representations, but what we want to do is make sure that we're using those most effectively so that we are helping people encode the information more quickly and make sure that they're having fewer errors when they do it. So like I said before, here is, what does this button do? Where is it going to take me? It's not there. And we have this small incidence rate, but it's not really like, I don't know why it's not at the top. It doesn't really make sense to me, because you're trying to find things here or wherever in whichever display. And then you're like, oh, this is the 28-day average. I thought maybe this was the overall average, but we would normally look at the top for a title. So that's a little bit odd for me. I would move that. And I would probably, if it was me, I would turn this into tabs, just because then you could see all of the available options at once and you would know which one you were on. So you'd have better orientation. Okay. So back to another chat box. I would like you, I have to check and see what it is today, but can you please tell me what today's date is in the chat box? However you want. June 23rd, June 23, 23 June 22. Any other examples? What if you're going to write it in a form for a hospital? We have day, month, year as written words. Yeah, we've got some numbers. Oh, look at you. There we go. Now I'm getting you get creative about the date. Isn't this wild? So what you may notice there, oh, and look at all the different examples. Almost, there might be two that are the same, but not that I can see very quickly anyways. So this is one of my pet peeves in life, is that we have so many options for dates, and a lot of them are ambiguous. So if we take, for example, today is not a good day, but if we took March 4th, it could either be March 4th or April 3rd if we were using numbers and did day, month, or month, year. And sometimes there are conventions, like European convention kind of change it is different from the American, and I can't remember. I think the Americans go month, day, year, maybe, or something weird. So they say it, I can't remember, but one of them is more how we would say it. Like we would say June 26th. We wouldn't say 26th of June, 22. But the idea here is that there have been studies that have shown that the best way to do it would be something to this effect. So you can shorten the month if you want to, if you don't want to spell it all out. But the idea is that the month has to be spelled out. And we have to use words for it so that we can't accidentally mix up. So it would be, in my example, it would be, so it would be the 4th of March, 2022, or it would be the 3rd of April. But when we look at those, our brains know very quickly that those are different. Can anyone think of examples, especially in healthcare, where dates might be important?
Birthday.
Birthdays to celebrate. Imaging results is a good example. Anything else?
Death date.
Birth date, yes. Date of birth, any other ones? Lab test dates, yes. What about vaccines? Vaccine schedules. Very important. So what we need to do is give users information in ways that's easy to get it in. Oh, Henry got it just in time. Get it into their heads really easily and not confusing it with somewhere else. So, for example, this one just makes me so sad. If you have to put, like, I get that sometimes databases force us into stuff, but how nice is it when you can put the data in any way, and then the system transforms it into what it wants, right? So for example, in my iPhone, I'll put in like June 23rd or whatever, and it'll say how it wants it and it reformats it. Or when they do that with phone numbers or that sort of thing, when they reformat it for you. Like we should have the capacity to do this. And then here we have month, day, year. Anytime you need a legend for your date, there's really no reason for this to me, to be honest. We could get away with a couple extra digits and and do we really need the precise time? Like probably we could find that somewhere else on the dashboard or on a wrist. Okay, so information coding, again, I talked about how even dating formats vary from country to country. Yeah, dates are one of our biggest challenges. So I'm going to spread it out to you and let you solve the world's biggest challenge of dates and let me know how that goes, because I've been complaining about it for a while. But it is really challenging and things can go awry if we mix them up, which is in healthcare especially. All right, so information coding. So here we have, so I've selected it and I've selected this area and then this pops up and I was like, okay, so I don't really know what that did because I was expecting when I clicked the map, I thought it was going to highlight what area I clicked on. But this isn't even, these aren't health authorities, these are health service delivery areas, which are not the same, turns out. And then if you click on it again, which I wouldn't have guessed that you could do, this is a little transparent because I was trying to line them up. But if you click on this part again, then it will open up and give you more of the data about this particular area, but that you can't see anymore. So it doesn't read like a button, which is a challenge, and it doesn't behave like I would expect it to, which is another challenge. And maybe it would make sense if we were going to look at health service delivery areas, maybe it would make sense to first look at health authorities and then break them down into health service delivery areas, because that's the way we think of the structure. It's hierarchical, right? We wouldn't go straight. I don't know. Is there an example for that? Am I wrong? Can someone think of a good one where we would go straight to health service delivery area in a province? You can think on it, but I'm not a clinician. So for me, this doesn't match the way my model thinks about it. Because I was like, okay, so you're talking about health authorities. We have health authorities here. It seems like this should be health authorities, but I was like, these lines look wonky. And then I had to like read it and think about it and then realize it was a button. So all of these things, I was very confused. You should have seen all of the thinkles that I had when I was using the system. Another thing that we should do is pay attention to typography. It can play a really big role. Lots of times your defaults are actually going to be designed for readability, which is great. I have had discussions with people, and Evangeline knows that I am very much a stickler for for fonts, and I don't like Calibri, and I don't like Times New Roman. Times New Roman is very clear, but I don't like it. I think I've just seen it too much in my life, both of them. And I'm very much a sans serif person. It tends to be easier to read on the web. There is some interesting research that says that if we put something in a harder to read font, people will actually slow down and are more likely to get the details out of it, but it's also a little bit mean. So I don't know, like if you did it in like a really like scripty font, people will slow down and read it and are more likely to be more accurate about particular things. But the idea is that most people are scanning your stuff. So we want to keep our font simple, and we don't want to have too many fonts, because the more fonts that we have, it again increases our cognitive load, which is what we don't want to do. We want to keep that low. So we only want a few levels, and then we can use our color to highlight as well. So we have just the top level font, the mid-level font, the data level font is the same as the low level font. And again, we've already kind of talked about this, but making sure that especially our typography or our fonts and type are high contrast, because again, you have to look at the duller ones, especially like this light blue on the white. I find that one the hardest to read for me. But we don't want to use our precious little noggin for things like that. We want people to get insights out of your data. We want them to have fabulous new ideas about how to solve the healthcare system. And we don't want them to be like low contrast color combinations. I mean, it's fuzzy too, but still. So we want to use simple legible fonts. So things like Arial, Helvetica, Gill Sans, Tahoma, or Verdana are pretty good. And again, you'll find that Power BI and Tableau default to ones that are more simple rather than these ones. Use a font that aligns with the decimal point. This is really important. If you have a decimal point, or if you're trying to align any sort of numbers, the digits should align, and making sure that we're using the appropriate level of detail. So here we have in millions. So we talked about that before. The other thing that to think about, again, sorry, this is fuzzy, but I didn't have a higher quality image of it, but the idea that we have to turn our heads if things are vertical. So if they're short, that may be okay, or even like on a 45-degree angle if you needed to put them below. But oftentimes we can get away with horizontal bar charts. They're easier on our eyes because that's the way our eyes are used to flow. So we read English from left to right, so we want to do that with our data as well when we have a lot of labels. I also want you to wave goodbye to pies. I know that pies have been a favorite of many people for a long time, but I'm here to encourage you and show you why they are not the best way to visualize our data. So the only thing worse design than a pie chart is several of them. Again, Edward Tufte and Save the Pies for Dessert by Stephen Few. So I'm not the only one who is the anti-pie advocate. But I would like you to know in the chat box what percent is the blue pie, blue slice. What do we got there?
25.
25. Yep. And no loud. Sorry for those who don't have keyboards. Yes, 25. Nailed it. I knew you're all so bright. Now I'm going to make it harder. Is it still? Oh, what about this one? Okay, we got 25. What do we think? 20?
20.
15.
Yeah. Now we start to scrap. Because this one's hard. And the thing is that we're just bad. If we're bad at telling visual angles, it's not a good way for us to do it. Does anyone want to hazard a guess at the largest? Well, I mean, we know the largest. So let's go like the second, third, fourth, fifth.
looks to me.
Yeah, they look the same size to me, but the perception is they're different because of the color and that saturation.
Yeah. Yeah, they all seem the same. They are so slightly different. Isn't that mean? And I wouldn't even, this one doesn't even look the smallest to me. This one does look a little bit bigger, but yeah, like it's hard for us to do. So this is why they're bad. And did we have any trouble interpreting? I mean, this one's ranked for us, but which is another thing, another tip that you can do is rank things for people, have it do it automatically so they don't have to make those thinkhole faces. We want to keep the Botox industry out of game with the people who are using your dashboards. We want them to have nice, calm foreheads. So, so when we can organize, that's great. Rank that way. But even if I was going to show you this in another way, you'd be able to do it faster if it was a bar chart than another one. So the idea is that you'll almost never see, here's the thing is you'll almost never see a bar chart that looks like this because we know they're so bad, right? We always see bar charts that have the percentage associated with them. And then, so it's trying to duplicate information. And if we think back to getting rid of all of the data to ink, we're not conveying this the most effectively. So we could add data labels, we could add a legend because we would have to move back and forth between the different spaces. Whereas if I asked you what category this one is, it's easier because it's right beside it. So there are just more effective ways. And then essentially what happens is by the time you do this, it's really just a table that's oriented around a pie. It's not really like, it's not the pie that's conveying the information, it's the labels. And we still are forcing people to do this more complex. So like a table would even be better in many cases. So pie axis, the idea here is that we're bad at them because we don't have an axis on them. So they're hard to compare. And even beyond that, we're just really bad. And we're even worse at 3D pie charts because just the way our human brain works. So it's not our fault. That's the good news. So I would like you to just say no to pie charts, please. And if I asked you here, who's doing better or worse over time of companies A through F? I'm not a monster, so I won't make you do it, but I'll show you this way and then you can see it more clearly. And the fastest way for us to do it is actually to integrate those because that's what we want to look at. And in that one that I showed you from Saskatchewan that had all those lines, it was a good idea, but the scale was obviously wrong. If all of them are clumped together and we can't see the differences between the lines, there's no space between them. So we have to think about those things too, that we need things to be as clear as possible. And here, this is really good too, because the legend is right next to the line. It's not separate. I once had a prof tell me, this was a million years ago, but on any of my stacked bar charts, they're like, make sure that your colors line up in the way that they are in the stack, which sometimes Microsoft doesn't want to do for me. But even better is to have them right next to them because you can't, it's right there. I know this is Purple's company D, of course. So again, the idea that we want to represent a whole is natural. And we've just, pies have been around for a while, so they're hard to say no to sometimes. And people might recommend them to you, like other stakeholders, that you have to be quiet, or tell nicely to be quiet, that pies are bad. And then you can show them. That's the whole thing, is that you can say, here's your pie chart, but what if I showed you this way? Which way is easier? And do little small comparisons and play tricks with their brains on them, and then they'll figure it out too. But we're much worse at interpreting these different charts above, and it's shocking that we still see so many pie charts, but I hope that you will move forward and be part of the solution. So I do love a good meme, and Meatloaf is hilarious. And so I also love this one. That's a pie chart, but otherwise pie charts are not good ideas. The one exception that I do have, I know you're like, Helen, you tell us no pies, no pies, no pies, and then I'll say donuts or a a single pie with only two things that you're comparing. So anything that's a univariate, yes or no, complete or incomplete, or that sort of thing, we're better at that if you want to have the value in percent pretty big, but sometimes you can just get away with the value in percent. But if you want to have a visual to support it, I will go along with that. As soon as you introduce any sort of third, any third is too many. We only want it to be two things in any of these, and then it's showing us what's happening. So we also see a lot of bubbles, and bubbles are almost as hard for us to do, for us to compare. So I'm going to encourage you to save them for the bathtub. And what I'd like you to do now, aloud or in the chat box, is tell me how many ones would fit into this larger one. How many times could we do that? What's the ratio here?
24.
Okay, 25. 4? Something. There's something. I don't even have an answer for that one. It's just hard, and we're inaccurate. That's what I'm telling you. So here's the thing too, is oftentimes, I don't have all the world's, I don't have answers to all the world's questions, but oftentimes we see this too, when we get into these bubble ones, we end up just having like this big blob here. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. And then try it. So what size is this one? Like, what does that represent right now? This is that, because here we even have to like see how big it is and then bring it over. I'm like, is it this one, or is it, I think it's this one, but it's hard. That's the whole thing, is these things are hard. So they're not really giving us that much. I'm glad you don't have any idea either. Thank you for your support. But yeah. Oh, that might've been the last question. No idea. I had no idea either. So it's hard because we're bad at measuring the differences between different things. So we tend to overestimate obtuse angles. So we tend to say that something that's just over 50% is farther over than 50%. And we underestimate acute angles. And then there's more on these wild ways our brain works that are predictable. We have seen them over and over. So the idea is, let's not use that. Let's use things that we are good, which line comparison. We're very good at that. So accuracy of graphical properties. I'd like you to, so these are different ways that we're good. We're good at knowing the position. We're good at seeing differences in length. We're good at the orientation of things and the area, but we get less good. So we're more accurate up here. So that's why bar charts, I know they're boring. And I know there are so many options out now, but they're boring, but they're also very effective. So we do have these trade-offs between things. Sometimes heat maps can work, but we're like differences in color magnitudes, we're also not super great at. So it can be a tough thing. And you might want to start out with that as your initial, but once your bubbles or whatever start overlaying each other, is that getting you anywhere? So these are tough design decisions that you'll have to make as you go. What I'd like you to do is embrace divergent bar charts for any sort of, usually they're Likert scale data that I use it for, and I'm going to show you some examples of why they're so great. So here we have, so first, this was initially shown in the pie, but so it's better, it's a different pie, but it was getting better. They put it into a bar chart. And so we have strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. And I guess the one thing I can say is at least these map onto how they are here. But what question do people disagree with most? Strongly disagree with most, or disagree with? Because that's the thing, right? We could kind of collapse, and you might want to think about doing that too. If you ever look at this data, sometimes it's better to look at disagreement and agreement, because those are like more anchored, and you could collapse them because you're showing whether people are positively and negatively associated with things. And it's not so much do they strongly disagree or disagree or strongly disagree. It's more just that they disagree, right? So think about that too when you're looking at your data. It might be worthwhile to simplify it from 5 to 3. Even faster is when we have something called a divergent bar chart. It's called a divergent bar chart because it diverges around the 0 line or the neutral line. So these are agree. This side is agreeing. This side is disagreeing, except that they put neutral to the left of 0, which is, I'll show you other options for neutral, but this is just an example. So what I don't like about this InfoVis are a few things. I don't like I just said, that the neutral's on the negative side. The color isn't very helpful because it's all like, it doesn't, usually what we want to do is we want to increase the strength of the color as we get more close to one of the poles. So if we have someone who strongly agrees with something, we would actually want that to be more of a concentrated color, and then more to the neutral, we would use like a gray or something, and then a lighter version of it for the agreeing. So the contrast on some of this is also bad. It's a little bit hard to read on them and on that. So the fastest thinking that we can do is having divergent bar charts. So we would have options. These are for when we have sentiments things. So we have the neutral middle. This is what I was saying is the options for neutral are that we can put them in the middle, which a lot of people do. But what that actually does is it spreads out our polar opposite feelings, sentiments. So interestingly, what some people have done is brought the strongest ones. So these are, let's say this is strongly agree, and the dark orange is strongly disagree. They put them next to each other because those are the strongest sentiments that people have. And then they get lighter and lighter to the outside, because really we're not too concerned with the neutrals. And then they split the neutrals between the two. Is this making sense? I hope so. The other thing that some people do is that they actually pull out the neutrals totally. So they will only look, so here we have agree and disagree, but they combined, like I said, they combine their strongly disagree and disagrees into just one value. Same with the strongly agrees and strong and agrees. And then they pull out the neutrals separately. And there's some argument for this that you can find there, but there's some argument for that saying that, you know, if we have a lot of people who are neutral on something, that might be telling us something. It might be telling us we're asking a bad question. It might be telling us that we're not giving the right options. It might be telling us lots of things. We might actually want to look at those neutral ones instead of just kind of having them hide out. But here is the least, this one's faster and fastest for us to be able to see what's going on. Okay, so the 10th and final heuristic is orientation. And this is the idea that your dashboard is a system that people need to know where they are and how they can move forward and back and all that sort of stuff. So we want to provide support for user and help orient them within the visualization. So we'll see that here. Like I said, what are we looking at in this little quadrant here? Any guesses? Is it too small?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. So it says health authority percent positivity by health authority. Yeah. But but by health authority. So what does this mean? Does it mean we're looking at a health authority? Yes. We are actually looking at Vancouver Coastal Health Authority's percent positive of the tested samples. And here's another example where the y-axis is going to vary because this is the overlap. But we'll see that it follows a similar pattern. If we weren't paying attention, we can map that on, but that's what we're going to concentrate on. So what I'm going to ask you next is, oopsie, sorry, 1 second. How could we make it more obvious that we're looking at Vancouver Coastal's percent positivity? At first, Lisa, do you want to answer how you knew that it was the percent positivity by health authority?
I've been looking at this dashboard a lot and I find it so confusing. I have so many problems with it. So I thought for this one we had to click on it to select a health authority, but I can't remember if I'm like I thought this was the average, and I thought we had to click and select a health authority.
Yeah, you do. So you have to click, I can't move my thing out of the spot, but it's up here. You have to click.
Oh, is it?
Click.
I thought
Yeah.
it was down on that one. See, that's so confusing.
It's so confusing. So now, do you have any suggestions to make it more obvious that we're looking at Vancouver Coastal's data?
I don't understand why they crammed so much on one dashboard. I felt there was too much and it should have been separated.
Definitely. And like I said before, the male female, this is the only dashboard that I know that is comparing the sexes on their response rates. And really, it looks quite balanced. So I don't know the benefit of that. But let's say that we wanted people to know for sure that we were looking at Vancouver Coastal's percent positivity. What would we do on this dashboard?
Could we make it the same color as what they had it? I thought they had them colored by health authority out somewhere, but I can't remember where.
They do here. Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, so it is red. Okay.
So it's colored, but it's
Yeah.
not, these don't even seem like they're connected. And here it looks more like this is, okay, so maybe this is Vancouver. No, that's not. That's the total, like I said. So they don't use consistent color coding, but that's a good idea. Anything else? Any other ideas, people? Other audience members? Don't want to pick on Lisa too much.
Put it in the title.
Yeah, right? I was queuing. Thank you. But like, come on, just put it right here and say Vancouver Coastals. It shouldn't be so hard. Other ways would be that they could also highlight it on the map. There could be multiple ways that we orient the user into what they're looking at and where they are and how to move between things. I think this is, yeah, I'm glad I'm not the only one who's been frustrated by this, but it is a good example for this class. Okay, so here, when we're looking at this, does anyone want to guess where we are first? What are we looking at? And what are the cues that's what we're looking at? Pardon?
It says North America in very tiny writing behind all the.
Yeah, North America, but what's the data saying?
I don't know.
It's the US.
Yes, it's the US. But what is the
Administrated.
There's
Yes.
concentration.
vaccine doses
Looks like the
administered?
Democratic states are doing a lot better.
And I don't know why it's, yeah. Oh, because the Virgin Islands. But yeah, so how did we know that this was vaccine doses?
Because of that tiny little title up there.
Yeah, this tiny little title. I mean, it's better than the other
Yeah.
one. At least it says it. Any other things on this dashboard that we would connect with vaccine doses? All of the other green stuff, right? So we have our weekly doses administered, 28 days, and totals. But all of the green stuff is actually connected. So that is a good example and shows us, yeah, where we are. The other thing is like they use tabs here, but they're a little contrast for me. How would you make this more obvious? What would you do to fix it? Reduce the clutter, yes. And if we're just looking at the US, we could hone in on the US a little bit more. Make the tab more obvious. Lots of things. All right. Okay, so those were the 10 heuristics. You may have seen that there is some kind of overlap between some of them. The idea is you don't have to get it perfect, but you should have some rationale as to why you picked one over another. So it's not a fine science. It's more of an art, but these heuristics can be really helpful in conveying why you don't want to do something in your design decisions with other people, especially with people like stakeholders or people who are going to disagree or people who are paying you. So that can be really helpful. And so then if you were going to do this, now that you're familiar with these heuristics, I would want you to use the system with the heuristics in mind. So you would go and say, okay, I want to know how many people got vaccinated in the US last week, or whatever your question is, but that's your task that you're trying to accomplish. And it's always important to record the version and the URL and the date that you're doing, because oftentimes we have revisions where things will get newer and better, hopefully. And then pick your specific tasks. Again, you want these to align with what users would be doing with your dashboard, ideally. And then you step through the system and you click step and figure out where you need to go to do stuff. Then, like I said, you want to identify and document the strengths and weaknesses. So in this case, you can use software or a template if you want, and you're going to say where it's doing really well and the heuristics is great. And then you also want to say where it violates a heuristic. It sounds so severe, where it goes against what the heuristic says, and then assign severities and to each of the issues. You don't do them with the ones that are good, because they are not severe. So you don't have to fix any of those problems. I also include comments and I include recommendations. I tend to do my recommendations kind of on the fly, and then I'll review them again later as well, because I find I'm like, oh, but why wouldn't it be up here? So I am already thinking about where I would have done it when I'm using the system, or where I would have put something, or how it would have looked, or what I was expecting. And those expectations come from our conventions and familiarity of using other systems. So it's really good for us to actually just include our recommendations right there. And then I often take screenshots of the good and bad examples and include them in a row. And I'll show you what this looks like. So there is some software. There's a free Chrome extension, and I think 7 of the 10 heuristics, might even be 8 of the 10 heuristics, were ones that were drawn from Nielsen. So they'll be in there. And then you can also add your own heuristic. So if you wanted to do this with a dashboard that's online, you can do that. You don't have to do that for today. I don't expect you to do that. But if in the future you wanted to do that for a conference paper or something like that, it's possible. There are also other systems that you can use that cost money. So here are the 10 overall. Here are the 10 with descriptions. I'm going to show you these in after we go for our little break and have some time for you to do the workshops or the stuff. And then what I want you to do is assign the usability problems severity ratings. So how bad is it? And ways that we know how bad it is so Nielsen came up with 4 levels: cosmetic, minor, major, and catastrophe. I find this one of the most challenging parts of heuristic evaluation. So I only use 3 levels and I still find it hard. So I use low, medium, and high. And basically, the idea is how destructive the error is to the overall functionality of the site on a scale of 1 to 4 or 1 to 3. Things that we want to think about are frequency. Is it going to occur for every person who goes there? Does it occur multiple times when they're using the system? Is it common or rare? How annoying is it? How much of an obstacle is it? Are users able to overcome it eventually? Do they have to muddle around for a bit or not? If they can't overcome it, then it's definitely more severe. And then persistence, does it happen over and over or only once in an encounter? And can users overcome it when they recognize it, or is it going to be annoying? And then what you want to do is use and collect all this data to inform the next iteration. So you want to assemble all of the data so you can count how many usability problems you saw. You can also look at their severity. And then you can include your recommendations. I'm just going to wrap this part of the talk. Well, we're close. If you have trouble with things when it's figuring out whether to push or pull a door, or the arbitrary vagaries of the modern computer, it's not your fault. Don't blame yourself. Blame the designer. I have slightly revised this quote, and I prefer to say, don't blame yourself, blame the design, so that it's not really like the designers often don't do things on purpose to make your life terrible. They make things maybe that are too beautiful that don't work, or, there are things that they overlooked, or they came at it from a different perspective, but most likely it's because they didn't talk to users. Users are so important. So I've changed it to blame the design. And so that's something that really important for you to do. So I think probably, because I don't want to take too long of a break so we can finish early, but what I'd like you to do is pick one public health information visualization or dashboard. You could look at any sort of public health topic you want. Let's steer clear from COVID, because we saw quite a few COVID dashboards this morning. or this afternoon, sorry, in the first part of the talk, and then write down its URL and then use it for a little bit and see what kind of questions would you ask it, and write down 3 times that you were annoyed, frustrated, or furious because of each visualization, and how bad was it? Did it prevent you from doing what you wanted to do? Did you get super lost? How bad? Low, medium, or high? And then also find 3 times, so just one dashboard or visualization, but 3 times that you didn't like it and 3 times that you liked it. And then I'm going to leave it for the break. If it's going to work, I'm going to leave it on this page so that you can see it and refer back to it, and try to assign each issue, each of your 3 issues, to one of the heuristics.